everybody, we are leaving Luther and the German Reformation for a little bit. In this video, we are going to look at the Swiss Reformation in Zurich. But first, I have a timeline up on the screen. I have a timeline on the Moodle page as well, just to give you an idea of what is happening. Kind of the way we have to approach this is we kind of go from place to place to place. But timelines help you see things that are happening simultaneously. For example, Zwingli dies the same year that the Virgin of Guadalupe appears in the Americas. I think in most people's minds, these events are very separate, but it's helpful to know, oh, these things are actually occurring around the same time. All right, so let's talk about Zwingli. He was a character. He was born in 1484 in eastern Switzerland. In a place called Wildhaus in the mountains. It's close to the Austrian border. I have a picture up. It looks super nice. Interestingly, you can still visit the place of his birth if you're so inclined. He is 1 year younger than Luther. His father was both a peasant and the mayor of a small town. His family was very, very religious. Of the 11 children born in that family, 5 went on to be religious of some sort, monks, nuns, priests. Okay. Zwingli was a really bright boy, and they sent him to go study at Basel, Bern, and then at the University of Vienna. He was made a local priest in 1506 in a town named Galeras. He was 22 at the time. At this point, he actually did not have any formal theological training. And I want to take a moment to talk about his lack of theological training. This was one of the big criticisms that reformers threw at the Catholic Church, that clergy simply did not know their theology, or Latin for that matter. And this proved to be a really big problem for Catholics as the Reformation progresses. Priests are suddenly having to contend with some very serious theological questions, and many of them did not have the ability to do so. Obviously, there were some folks who were really, really educated. Luther was one of them, but your kind of average parish priest may not have had that solid of a theological training, okay? At the Council of Trent, which we will talk briefly about next week, they do address this point, and from that point forward, clergy get a much better theological training. But in 1506, they weren't there yet. Okay. So in 1516, he moves to a new city, and he has quite a scandal. There's rumors of an affair with the barber's daughter in town. It nearly ruined his career. However, he blames it completely on the woman, and he ends up kind of salvaging his career, but he gets moved to Zurich. So in 1519, he's there, and he's appointed as the people's priest, which was a pretty prestigious post. Zurich was a city of about 5,000 people, with about 50,000 in the surrounding areas. It was run by councils, by a large council called the Large Council, very creatively named, or 200, and a small council with 50 members. The Large Council dealt with foreign affairs, taxation. They chose a mayor. The small council dealt with domestic issues. The members were elected to both councils. I'm sharing this with you because we will touch on the councils again in a minute as kind of Zurich decides to embrace Reformation. All right, so moving to Zurich allowed Zwingli the opportunity to study more. He had learned Greek by himself. Since there was no one to train him, he would kind of consistently have errors that never got fixed because nobody was teaching him, okay? But in a city like Zurich, he could get a much, much better education. Just a kind of an interesting fact there, he nearly died of the plague in 1519 once he arrived. But he did survive. He survived so he could launch a Reformation. All right. So what is the relationship between Zwingli and Luther? The first time Luther's name appears in Zwingli's letters, it was in 1518, so not long after the 95 Theses. Zwingli read much of what Luther wrote and also disseminated materials in the area, okay? Though this speaks to Zwingli's kind of personality. Zwingli would later deny that Luther had any influence on him whatsoever. He said, "I do not want to be called Lutheran, for I did not learn the teachings of Christ from Luther, but from the Word of God." So what's going on here? Self-preservation, pride, legitimate differences in doctrine. He said Luther propelled him to eagerness. All right. And the two do come to different opinions on certain matters. I will absolutely give him that. Okay, so let's talk about this reform in Zurich. It all began in 1522 with the eating of pork sausages during Lent. I know, it doesn't sound that scandalous, but eating sausages is hardly revolutionary, but everyone knows you can't eat meat on Fridays during Lent. By doing so, it was a statement, all right? It became known that there was a dinner party in which sausages were eaten. There was an investigation by the city councils. Zwingli had been at the dinner, though he had not eaten a sausage, but he had not intervened when others ate the sausages. Okay. So soon after this sausage scandal, he publishes Concerning the Choice and Freedom of Food. He defended the consumption of the sausage, and the published tract explored the relationship between faith, works, inward piety, and outward rules. It echoed freedom of a Christian in certain ways. The Christian is above the law. The impetus for moral action does not come from external rules, but inward commitments. Eating sausages is one thing, but in 1522, Zwingli makes a much stronger statement. He gets married. He shows up to church with a woman named Anna Reinhardt, which at the time kind of meant a marital commitment. He insisted that the Bishop of Constance marry them. The bishop declined. Zwingli then published a tract against clerical celibacy. All right. Church and state. Let's talk a little bit about that. Reformation tracts are making their way into Switzerland. Zwingli himself is writing persuasive tracts. Now, in the U.S., religion is a matter of personal choice, but that is not the case in the 16th century. There is no separation of church and state in Zurich. There is no separation of church and state in Europe, really at all, in reality. This would have been a completely alien concept to them, all right, this idea of church and state. So keep that in mind as we continue here. By 1523, the Catholic Church and the state in this case being the Swiss Confederacy, had decided the reformers were heretics, although reform sentiments were spreading. What is interesting here is that Zurich decided to hold kind of a debate to discuss religious matters rather than just condemn the reformers within the Swiss Confederacy. Okay, why? I'm sure were council members who were genuinely persuaded by reform sentiments. There was genuinely a desire to kind of rein in the power of the Catholic Church. All right, there was always some sort of back and forth between secular leaders and religious leaders. Okay, and then practical questions. If the Reformation was really taking root in the city, could they just say no to reform? Okay, so at this big debate in the city, things didn't pan out quite like the council had thought. Zwingli argued many points based on scripture. The Catholics absolutely refused to debate Zwingli. Actually, they refused to participate in this debate at all. And the council decided that since no one had debated Zwingli on these issues of reform, he was free to continue to do what he was doing in the city, and Reformation continued. Okay, why wouldn't the Catholics debate? All right. You saw this other places too. They argued that since they were the one true church and they didn't need to argue with heretics, they wouldn't. All right. A few notes worth considering here. The city did not just default to the Catholic position here. All right. They also felt that they were the religious authorities here, not the church, which is really interesting. And although this debate wasn't a debate at all, in the wake, monks and nuns actually left their monasteries. All right. So this was pretty catastrophic for the Catholic Church within Zurich. All right. A baptism was done in German, not in Latin following this. Art started disappearing from churches. Simply put, the Reformation continued on. I want to highlight some differences in theology between Luther and Zwingli. There are some pretty significant differences, okay? For the most part, Luther was willing to keep any religious practice or tradition that did not contradict the Bible. You know, he was fine with religious art. The Mass didn't change all that much, okay? Zwingli rejected anything that did not have scriptural support, all right? This means a lot of changes, okay? Your book uses the example of like organs and violins were banned because they are not in the Bible. Communion should not be celebrated too often, preferably 4 times a year was kind of the correct number. Communion was always served in both kinds and seated versus, you know, if you're a Catholic Mass, you go up to the front, you know, the kind of the altar and the priest gives it to you. And there was very different ideas of the Lord's Supper, okay? And this is something that Zwingli and Luther argued about. Luther believed in real presence, okay? So it's different than transubstantiation, which the Catholic believes in, which the bread and wine are literally transformed into the body and blood of Christ. Real presence is the wine and the bread are still there, but Christ's body is also there. Zwingli, though, said this is just symbol, okay? Once we get to Calvin, we're going to see a slightly different take on that as well. Calvin said, like, Christ is spiritually in the bread and the wine. Okay, so we're getting like kind of 4 distinct views of the Lord's Supper. Okay, so back to Zurich. In 1524, the Zurich City Council had all images removed from churches. In 1525, the Mass was discontinued. All right, the Mass was replaced by a simple communion service. First a sermon, then the people got bread and wine. The service was in the vernacular, so the local language, not Latin, and it became a communal gathering for the congregation to commemorate Christ's death. So, in conclusion, we are beginning to see the fragmentation of the Reformation. Zurich is not Wittenberg. Yes, Zwingli absolutely read Luther, but he doesn't want to be a Lutheran. There is a different political situation in Zurich, and the reforms evolve very differently. Zwingli also comes to some significantly different theological conclusions than Luther does. Even in Wittenberg, you see a conflict between Luther and some of his colleagues, especially Karlstadt, who end up going kind of a more reformed theology track like Zwingli or Calvin. All right, so we're going to leave Zurich for now. We are going to turn to the Anabaptists in a moment here. Though this is not the end of Zwingli, we will return to him later in our section on our unit on Reformation. All right, thanks everybody.